have the means and instruments to pursue such a policy effectively and with a chance of success? And is the concept of middle powers showing the world a way still appropriate? Thirdly, in an ideal world, what should be short, medium, and long-term foreign policy fields in which Canada and Germany, individually or united, could act successfully, and how? And last but not least, what role plays social media regulation in foreign policy? As agreed upon, the first speaker is Senator Peter Harder. Senator, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Those are all wonderful and complex questions, and we've been given 5 minutes to enlighten everybody with respect to these questions. Let me begin by saying thank you for this opportunity. I believe that Canada-Germany needs to have more dialogue and more engagement on both sides of that dialogue than we have traditionally. I think in Canada we become hostage to our colonial past and perhaps to 20th century history to engage as fully with Germany as we ought, in my view. I want to begin by putting a context to your first question, which I think is really important, and that is the role of foreign ministries and the nature of the ability of foreign ministries to exercise their mandates. It's odd, isn't it, that in the era of globalization, where the domestic agenda is so influenced by global affairs, that foreign ministries appear to be less important in the governmental apparatus of both countries, and yet we know that the transitions we are collectively engaged in have a strong requirement for both international and multilateral action. Here I'm thinking of, we're dealing with 3 mass extinction events at once. That is the threat of nuclear holocaust, the threat of climate change, the threat of pandemics, and an era of transitions where the geopolitical game that we have been used to is changing with the rise of Asia, China in particular, and the decline, at least relative decline, of the United States, which I would argue, at the time when we are all transitioning to a lower carbon economy. The digital economy is changing the nature of business and commerce, and the nature of work is changing the issues around human capital at a time when people in our respective countries are demanding more inclusivity and shared prosperity. This poses huge problems. Now, the question was posed as to why are the foreign ministries declining? I'd make 2 points. One is, as the professor has pointed out, relationships matter, and the tenure of Madame Merkel and the tenure of Schröder, the stability of German chancellors, have given a stability to the overall relationship. Yet underneath, I think we'd have to collectively go back and say Steinmeier and Fischer were the last foreign ministers of significance. And similarly, on the Canadian side, while the prime ministers have been relatively stable, the foreign ministers that stand out in the sweep of the 15 years and more are Lloyd Asquith and Joe Clark. That is somewhat around the ability they had to engage more broadly and have more time in office to build the relationships that allowed them to engage with their counterparts both in Germany and elsewhere, or in Canada and elsewhere. And I think we need to encourage the development of personal relationships at the very top. I think the new German government is facing a suite of issues that is not different than the Canadian government is, for some of the reasons I've outlined, and there is much that we could learn from each other. I'm thinking of, we are countries that are committed to liberal democracy and rule of law, but also in ensuring that our capitalism is played out with a degree of social responsibility, that the geopolitics of our moment require a broader diplomatic engagement, I think, than we are experiencing to date. and that the tools of that engagement are ones that we need to share more broadly. Canada and Germany have opportunities in the multilateral sphere. I'm thinking of WTO, WHO, reform in particular, but also in learning from our shared priorities in international areas. Here again, international development opportunities, new energy technologies, the decarbonization of our economies, the research institutions that can play a cooperative role and have played, and the nature of our business engagement. We're both extremely rich in our trading culture and in our research capacity and in our lack of interest in or ability for big power politics. I'm going to leave it at that for the first 5 minutes, but look forward to a broader engagement.
You did very well, Senator. Thank you very much for your statement. By the way, if you see me again, that means your 5 minutes are up. That's the sign instead of a missing bell. Professor Tworek, you are next.
Thank you so much, Will. Well, thank you so much for having me in this discussion. And I'm going to use the couple of examples to think through these really provocative questions. So one is thinking about social media regulation, a problem confronted by both Germany and Canada, and the other is a little bit thinking about the pandemic. So drawing on what Senator Harder said of what are some of the similar problems that both Germany and Canada confront. So I think if we look at these two questions, we see some things that illuminate part of why foreign ministries have become perhaps comparatively less important. One is that we see quite often domestic ministries doing things that we might see as foreign policy, or as things that gain traction in the international realm. So, for example, one of the ways in which German policy has been most influential in Canada, one could argue, is in providing precedents and ideas for how to regulate social media. So Germany was in many ways a first mover in the space of trying to regulate social media content. And in 2018, it came into force a law called the Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz, or the Network Enforcement Law, which required social media companies with more than 2 million users in Germany to react within 24 hours to when users posted complaints about speech that those users thought were contravening 22 statutes of German speech law. And this was very important globally because it set a precedent for a national government trying to regulate against what were at that point primarily US-based social media companies. And this domestic law has actually become quite a precedent for a whole host of countries around the world. In some cases, troublingly, when authoritarian regimes have pulled on part of this law, but it's also been an inspiration for the Canadian federal government as well, which had in its mandate letters of the previous government actually sort of ideas about how to regulate social media that came straight out of the German law, including having up to 24 hours for social media companies to look at posts and to take down things that were directly contravening speech law within Canada. That came out as a technical paper before the election, and now we haven't seen much movement after the election of 2021. But it's just to give you an example of how actually a lot of what we might then think of as foreign policy is happening in those domestic realms. And I'd argue that's just one example. Another way in which this is playing out, I think, is that both Germany and Canada are confronting a similar problem, which is that there are global issues which are getting dealt with in domestic ministries. So this is quite obvious in the digital realm. Both Canada and Germany are struggling with the same problem, which is that the digital realm is everywhere, but it's not clear which ministries deal with it. And if we look at what's happening within the coalition government, there was a renaming of the Ministry for Digital Infrastructure and Traffic, one might call it, to be about traffic and digital things, but now there are currently still fights about exactly where digital infrastructure sits. And technically, according to a diagram, there are 6 different ministries in Germany that are dealing with this. And we see a similar problem in Canada, where it's not always 100% clear exactly where digital things sit. But one place that it doesn't seem to sit in either country is within foreign ministries. And in some ways, that's quite surprising because most of the social media companies that we are talking about are not companies that are domestic to either Germany or Canada. They're in fact multinationals based in the US, or in the case of TikTok, based in China. So one might imagine there would have been roles for the foreign ministry. So I think that's one way in which we see things transforming, domestic ministries dealing with what might have been traditionally foreign policy issues. So what are some of the opportunities then? I've already highlighted one of them. It is that both Canada and Germany are dealing with a similar issue, which is how can middle powers actually find some way to interact with and regulate social media companies, which are massive multinationals that are based in countries that are not Germany or Canada. So one of the arguments there is that you might need to have simultaneous domestic legislation. You might need to think about how there are actually interactions between those legislations so they can actually have some effect. You might want to have more dialogue in those kinds of realms, and it may be a space for foreign ministers to have discussions as well. There have also been suggestions, including from the Centre for International Governance Innovation, which is based in Waterloo in Canada, that what you need to deal with the digital realm is something akin to what you had to deal with financial crises. So instead of a financial stability board, which is what you had to deal with financial crises, you should have a digital stability board. And in the ideas and eyes of CIG, the Centre for International Governance Innovation, countries like Canada's middle powers have the ability to convene and might be the kinds of places that could be locations for things like a digital stability board. And indeed, Germany, I think, takes many of the same positions, or certainly could do within this new coalition government, that's what middle powers could be doing, being conveners. And I just add at the end that that's something we're seeing within the pandemic, because Berlin is now a hub for the WHO, the World Health Organization's new pandemic and epidemic intelligence hub. So we see here's a role potentially for middle powers, once again, being headquarters for hubs, whether digital stability boards in the case of what CIG is suggesting, or WHO intelligence centers, as what is happening in Germany. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Professor Tworek. Third in line is Professor Daniel Stockemer.
So 1 second. So yeah, also, I want to also thank everyone for having me. And I had a short discussion with Elizabeth, and she asked me if I can just present like what to expect, or what can we expect from German policy from the new coalition. So it's a little different, but I think complementary what the first two speakers said. So first, general outline of the German foreign policy, and I would say continuity rules. So the traffic light coalition is positioning itself in the mainstream of German policy, and there's no sign of radical change from the Merkel era. But change may come, but it might not be a radical one. And German's foreign policy continues to be based on two pillars, the EU and NATO, with Russia and China as key challenges. So what I've done now, I've looked to the coalition treaty yesterday and looked, okay, what's in the treaty about the EU, about NATO, about USA, Russia and China, to give you like a broad overview of what we can expect. So for the EU, it says in the treaty, the EU remains a pillar of German foreign policy. It says German interests shall be defined in light of European interests, and Germany should serve the EU. And then there's a term of what's called strategic sovereignty. And this means Europe should develop sovereignty in the fields of energy, health, raw materials, and digital technology. NATO, also a key role in the coalition agreement. In security issues, NATO is given the central role. NATO remains indispensable foundation of our security. The next German government commits to nuclear deterrence, and especially in light of the concerns of Central Europeans. For the US, there's a lot on the US about in the new coalition agreement, and there are plenty of issues. For example, Germany wants to strengthen rule-based international order, pushing back against authoritarian developments and cooperating on the eastern and southern neighborhoods of the EU with the US. Moreover, the coalition is looking for a climate and energy partnership with the US and to work together on human rights, geopolitical questions, global health, trade, connectivity, international standards, and disarmament. For Russia and China, I read the coalition government, there might be a little bit of a tougher stance. On Russia, the coalition government is rather critical, especially regarding Moscow's policy towards Ukraine and Belarus, but also regarding repression of democratic freedoms, especially mentioned in the coalition government. And on China, the agreement calls on China to play a responsible role in its neighborhood and criticizes human rights violations of the province of Xinjiang. it also promises that Germany is going to work with value partners in the Pacific region to balance China. So challenges, and this brings me to Norbert's question, importance of foreign policy in the priorities of the German government has declined. In the Merkel government, it was number 3. Now it's number 4 after economic affairs, climate action, finance, and interior. And there are potential contradictions. The new government stresses both the need of a more value-based approach in foreign policy, but also at the same time in the coalition government, the need to cooperate with autocratic governments. And another question is, and this also answers Norbert's question a little bit, but I leave it as an open question, is whether Scholz will monopolize relations with great power in the chancellery, or whether there will be space for the foreign minister to pursue her own agenda, which will probably be a little more value-based than the agenda of the new German Chancellor. I leave it as such, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Professor Daniel Stockemer. There were very tight presentations, strictly according to the time limit, which was set, which gives us a little bit more space for the conversation, which I would like to start now. The CIC, our partnering organization tonight, has in its mission the statement that they would like to engage or interest Canadian citizens into foreign policy subjects and help them to design or in any way shape Canada's position in the world. Senator Harder, do you think so far the organization has been successful, judging from the interest of the Canadian population in these activities, or in really participating in any kind of foreign policy related activity in Canada?
That's a very good question. I think that all of us would agree that foreign policy has rarely, in Canada at least, been the ballot question in elections. Governments have rarely, there is one example I could cite, but rarely turned on issues of foreign policy. What's also true, though, is the issues on which the ballot questions turn are often global in their context. And whether it's climate action, which is high on the agenda, or the changing nature of the fourth digital revolution, which is made more global by the nature of the technological revolution we're undergoing, or whether it's the movement of peoples, which has strained politics in Europe, and Canada has its own unique experience in that regard, or indeed the call for a more values-based foreign policy, where some would argue, and I would be among them, that foreign policy is really a balancing act between what is just with what is possible, and that changes in the context of circumstances and issue. But I do believe that the issues on foreign policy are hugely important for the well-being of individual Canadians, and it's important that organizations like the CIC, like the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, engages civil society and informs that debate more effectively than in the past, to remind everybody that foreign policy is not about pinstripe suits or cocktails or press releases on major international gatherings. It's actually the meat and potatoes of our self-interest.
I think it was Palmerston who said domestic politics determines how we live, foreign politics determines whether we live. You're obviously referring to that. Yeah, it is. Yeah. It's often also attributed to Bismarck. I haven't found a reliable source. Yeah, but it's clearly going to your direction.
I think Madam Merkel would appreciate the quote as well, being referenced to her.
Yeah. Okay, Professor Tworek. Social media have to do something with soft power, I guess, a lot to some extent. However, from my personal experience and having lived 17 years in Asia, I was confronted with a very different concept of power, and what is perceived there as a decline of the US is often related to the fact that the US have neglected to project their power. That's what many Asian heads of government and state will tell you in international conferences. And what they are referring to is you hardly see United States power, hard power anymore in Asia. There is not so many aircraft carriers and missile launch sites and everything. And you see, it is perceived as a withdrawal if you do not project your hardware military power. However, in the last 20 years, we often have had a debate about the influence of soft power based on the concept of Joseph Nye. And the Konrad Adenauer Foundation itself is an instrument of German soft power, and I think quite a successful one. So what is more important, hard power or soft power? And do we possibly see a turn back to the hard power times now, looking at the current global conflict situation?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one that's also debated as to whether hard power and soft power is as much of a distinction as Nye would want to make it, especially when we see how potentially information can, in certain circumstances, change perceptions and change what people do in very sort of meaningful ways. We need only think of anti-vaxxer disinformation as genuinely affecting whether people live or die. But I think that part of the way to think about this is also to build on some other ways that some scholars have thought about this. So some have said, maybe instead of thinking about hard and soft power, we think about sharp power. So that instead of the US intervening in the sort of more traditional ways of 15, 20 years ago, then instead it's intervening in very specific areas, sharp power. And I think for others, they would argue that there are some areas where American power appears to have increased. So if we think about let's say in many countries around the world, how in fact their communications are structured. If you are living in a country in Africa, it may be that the main thing you are using to communicate might be Facebook basics, right? So even your very ability to communicate is really structured around an American multinational, which can have a whole host of different effects on how you live. So I guess one could say in some ways that power is sometimes more invisible to people because we think about these platforms as things we use every day, and sometimes people aren't even aware of which company owns which one, right? So that Instagram is owned by now Meta, which is what Facebook is called. So I guess I tend to see it as not so much of a dichotomy, than in fact we still see huge power of certain American multinational companies. But I think the final thing that I would just add very briefly is that that all has ramifications for what's happening within the US domestically, because in the fights around antitrust and approaches to companies like Facebook/Meta and Google, one of the arguments that they are bringing to the table is that they shouldn't be regulated through antitrust because they need to be large to be able to push back against Chinese companies. So we see there that actually, maybe to flip your question, arguments about geopolitics are being drawn into spheres and arguments around what we might think of as traditionally more soft power.
Thank you, Professor Tworek. Daniel Stockemer, you have referred in your presentation also to the role which the EU plays in the context of German foreign policy. Now, if you ask a German diplomat, he will refer to as a doctrine of German foreign policy to the basic principles of never again, meaning not that kind of power foreign policy which ultimately led to the Second World War, and never alone. That means a strong commitment to combine our own foreign policy initiatives with other EU member states. But couldn't we also say in that leaving foreign policy initiatives to the EU also symbolizes a kind of, I would provocatively call it, like foreign policy laziness to think about alternatives, or if I push everything to a higher level, I free myself of any kind of responsibility. And I also do not necessarily take into consideration whether my foreign policy will actually be result-oriented if I do not have control. I see quite different interests on the EU level when it comes to foreign policy matters, despite having a person responsible for that area. How do you see this problem? Is there a contradiction or does it influence the effectiveness of national foreign policy? Or doesn't it make any sense at all, like to have a foreign policy coordinator on the EU level?
I mean, it's a great question, but also a question that's quite difficult to answer. And I would say, yes, Germany is very more reluctant to even to go further but on the one hand, you're right. On the one hand, they push it to the EU, but on the other hand, there are no German initiative, for example, for a joint foreign minister, or there are no initiatives for, I mean, that the EU becomes a stronger actor. I mean, but I mean, if you compare like Germany and France, France wants to much more independence, for example, from the US. Germany is like, I think in the new government agreement, what I read is like, we want to go in all directions, but we don't want to really decide where to go. I mean, there's strong US corporations, there's strong EU, this strategic sovereignty is strong, but it doesn't go beyond that. There's, for example, no question of military sovereignty. And on the other hand, there are contradictions with regard to like China and Russia. There's no clear opinion about Nord Stream, for example, whether we want it or not. And then also when you hear the German foreign minister, for example, when she was in Russia, she was touching the question. And so I think I think we don't know where it goes, whether Germany also in view of the crisis wants to go more towards I mean, a common EU foreign policy, or wants to do its own things. We also don't know how strongly, for example, Scholz will get involved in, let's say, the Ukraine conflict. Will there be a German initiative in part of the Normandy coalition, for example, to hold peace talks again? For me, it's fluid, but for me, it's not that it's clear that Germany prefers one or the other. It's also, do we do an ideal-based politics or do we do real politics? It's a little bit both. So we don't know where it goes, but I think what Senator Harder said before, it's probably a little of both, and probably a pragmatic view, and probably not too much idealistic policy, despite the fact that this is especially strongly propagated by the two small coalition partners. I don't know if I dodged your question, but that's kind of, yeah, it's kind of what I have.
I only asked it because I was wondering if the average guy in the streets in Ottawa and Berlin was asked by a reporter, can you explain what's your country's foreign policy in 5 sentences? Senator Harder, do you think anybody would know in Canada?
Not with a question posed like that, because I don't think people consider foreign policy as an identification of the issues that we're speaking of. But if you talk to the average person about international cooperation on climate action, or if you talk about pandemic management, or if you talk to them about transitioning the industrial sector in auto sector in Ontario, which is where I'm from, to an electrification of vehicles, they would see that as hugely important, but they wouldn't connect it to the word foreign policy. And yet we know that foreign policy, multilateral cooperation, bilateral cooperation are the keys to moving forward on all of these issues.
Thank you. I'd like to go at this point into our Q&A session because I have 5 questions here already. The first of which comes from Peter McKinnon, and he asks, can any of the panelists comment on the threat of artificial intelligence to geopolitics? For example, fake news, election disruption, character deformation, and the like. Who would like to answer? Senator Harder, would you start? And then,
well, let me start. I think Peter's asking a really important question, and it undermines implicitly the confidence we can have in our democratic institutions. So our state, our intelligence apparatus is very involved in ensuring the integrity of our respective elections. In Canada, you know that this was explicitly referenced before the election, and we see what's going on in the States and have to conclude that there are significant risks in the way in which artificial intelligence is being used by our adversaries or the ideological adversaries even within our state, our respective states, to undermine democratic institutions. And that's one area where I do think our unique and common values of liberal democracy and rule of law can express itself in some shared statements, but also shared intelligence on this issue.
Okay, thank you. The next question comes from Steve Henderson, and he asks, how can Canadians help Germany in achieving its foreign policy goals? Maybe Daniel, can you offer a German perspective on that?
I mean, it is a little difficult to answer. As I said, the question before, what you said, it's very hard to say, okay, what are the precise goals? What are number 1 goal, number 2 goal, number 3 goals? I think there should be cooperation in climate change. I think where Canada promote the free trade agreement, that can be an agreement that travels to other countries, or being like an agreement that other countries might adopt or other partners might adopt in similar form. And I mean, there needs to be cooperation. I would add conspiracy theories. There needs to be, and also there might be also strong cooperation, for example, electoral assistance. I mean, Canada is one of the few countries that's part of the OECD. And so but I think main point is climate change. Second point is election, potentially free trade. I mean, the agreement is like a pillar of Canadian-German relations. And secondly, I mean, there's always a need of cooperation in areas like conspiracy theories, in areas like fake news, what we said, in areas like digital technologies. So I think that there can be stronger cooperation. Also, potentially, when we come back to your first about the median power question, there can potentially be strong, maybe even bilateral initiatives that can travel and maybe get more partners involved.
Which brings me to how should we coordinate like our voting behavior in international organizations, for example? Yeah. Senator Harder, is that something?
I would welcome German support for Canadian candidates in international organizations. Too often the EU gangs up to express its internal preference for these positions. But yeah, I think that there is an opportunity because we are like-minded and we have both a respect for and a bit of caution on the dominance of American foreign policy or American interests. I think 2 other areas, Daniel, where we can cooperate are international development assistance, because of the shared priorities in those areas, and our immigration experience and multiculturalism. That has been Germany is one of the adopters of the Canadian approach. And that is an experience which I think we should have more direct conversations around, and its implications for our respective societies.
Thank you. The next question comes from John Packer, and John asks, what should we understand from the recent public statements and publicly shared of then resignation by the now former German admiral? Okay, this refers to.
I can get it.
You can answer that.
I mean, this refers to, there was a German admiral that made kind of defamatory remarks about Ukraine, say the Russian threat is not that big. He understands the Russians, and was basically playing down the whole conflict, and was also providing some derogatory remarks about Ukraine. And as a result, he had to resign. And this undermined or put a rather bad light on like the common effort to maybe create a deterrence against Russia and to create a common response. So I don't think this will have large consequences in the broader scheme, but it was a little disruptive event also within Germany, and potentially also, a little harmful event in the broader scheme, because it hurt like a common strong response also from all forces in Germany. And so, but yeah, after he made these comments, he resigned a couple days later, or was told to resign.
Yeah, I think that summarizes it pretty well. Michel Boucher, he asks, why does Germany seem to be more ambivalent than France about the creation of an autonomous European army, both logistically and materially? Don't know who would like to answer that. Yeah. Daniel, would you give it a try?
Oh, maybe it has to do with the,
because you come from a region which German region which borders to France, and maybe
I mean, but it maybe has maybe historical reasons also. I mean, France is seen as a great power, or la grande nation. It's one of the few powers that has its own atomic weapons. The military plays a much larger role in France, and so implicitly France probably also wants to lead, especially with the UK no longer be a strong force in this army. And also France as a former great power is potentially also, I mean, there's more animosity. Germany takes a more cautious role, for example, against US, a more cooperative role. France says clearly we need to provide our own European security. And so, and the German foreign policy is kind of geared towards the EU and security issues, but also towards the US very strongly. And so this might explain the more cautious role of Germany. It might be in history, but also in kind of priorities and realpolitik of the German government right now to go, I mean, both directions, to have a stronger EU military cooperations, but not a full army. And on the other hand, strengthening cooperation with transatlantic relations, basically. And France wants to be more independent.
Yeah, I think one has to live on the other side of the Atlantic to understand the reasons to the full extent. Heidi, maybe I like you to answer the next question. It comes from Margaret Huber, and I would like to send a warm greeting towards Margaret, who is the past president of the CIC in Ottawa, the Ottawa branch. And Margaret says, herself having served for many decades in the Canadian Foreign Service, tonight's expert speakers are well recognizing that as tensions rise in hotspots like Ukraine, both German and Canadian governments are facing major challenges to foreign and defense policies. But how can diplomacy be effective without credible threats to those who would change borders or repress human rights? How can our governments better build support for robust diplomacy?
Oh, Margaret, it's a great question. I think it goes right to the heart of those debates about what can a middle power do. And this is part of what scholars have been debating: is a middle power a convening power? How much room do they really have for maneuver if you find that, for example, the United States is no longer interested in doing something? And I think we're finding that out in different ways. So how can we build better and more robust support for democracy? I think some of that is by building some of those coalitions amongst middle powers, and maybe around particular issues as well. So recognizing that if there is a robust interest in something like human rights in content moderation, to take social media as an example, is it channeling that through European legislation? Is it channeling it through the United Nations, and sort of figuring out those kinds of things, and which international organizations also maybe spaces for some of these conversations with greater coordination could be one way of trying to do this. But I think we need to recognize that some of these things are going to be extremely difficult if, for example, the United States takes particular turns. And one thing I would just add that for me is always a sort of unique and extraordinary thing about Canada is also what it can bring to Germany is a real in-depth knowledge of the United States, and that's also amongst ordinary citizens. So to just give you one example, a study that was done by McGill's Media Ecosystem Observatory looked at 200,000 Twitter accounts of power users, so people who use Twitter a lot in Canada, and found that they were 10 times likelier to retweet somebody who was based in the US than someone who was based in Canada. and that they followed many more people who are based in the US than who are based in Canada. So it means that what happens in the US is something that both Canadians are very informed about, but also they're very influenced by. So if we think about Germany trying to figure out its transatlantic relations, well, Canada is a great place to try and do that, actually, because you have a citizenry that's extraordinarily well informed as to what is happening in the US, but aren't themselves US citizens. But I do think that what you present, Margaret, is not a challenge where I have one easy answer. I think part of it is about picking the particular issues that are of deep global importance. And I'd add just one further, which is the pandemic and global vaccine equity. And that's an issue where both Canada and Germany have made big pledges, but we're yet to see them fully be implemented. And I think that actually, when we think about human rights questions, that's a huge human rights question. It's really destroying the credibility of Europe and North America to not be delivering on some of those promises within COVAX.
Thank you, Heidi. Michel Boucher, again, he asks, is German foreign policy being influenced by the rise of the Alternative for Germany, the right-wing party? Daniel, what do you think?
I think first the AfD lost votes. We have to remember that. I mean, they lost about 2 percentage points. They were 12.6, and I think now 10.5. And I would say no as an answer. Why? Because foreign policy is not strong in the, first of all, not strong in the AfD ideology, in the AfD rhetoric, in the AfD propaganda, if we call it. I mean, what the AfD would like, they would have a strong cooperation with Russia, for example. But I don't think the government is influenced by this wish in their policy formation. I think the AfD is kind of an anti-system outside party. And so the AfD is not influencing what other parties or what the mainstream foreign policy is doing. And I think that's also not their main goal. The AfD is a nationalist party that, first of all, thinks about Germany and Germans. And foreign policy is not strong in their agenda. So I think the AfD has very little influence on German foreign policy.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm afraid the next question is also for you, because Akash Maharaj, I hope I pronounced the name correctly, asks, from a German perspective, does Canada appear to have a rational foreign policy, one that seems to pursue clear objectives through effective measures guided by a set of defensible overarching principle or values?
Okay, it's again a different one. The answer is no. And maybe I can answer with an example, how it's so difficult for Germany right now to have a clear value-based foreign policy. I mean, we've talked about ideal-based foreign policy, so doing what is right, and realistic or real foreign policy, do what is necessary to preserve foreign strategic and economic interest. And the big example I can provide is energy. Germany needs foreign gas. And so on the one hand, energy prices are rising by more than 20%, needs foreign gas, but on the one hand, cooperating with Russia, making economic deals is not the right thing to do. And so Germany is in a dilemma, and we don't know where the pendulum will move. And so a purely value-based or purely realistic foreign policy won't happen. There are issues that are just very difficult to balance the two. So I don't know, giving from this example, if we can talk about that there is a clear value-based or clear real policy, also maybe a clearly predictable foreign policy. I mean, the challenges Germany is having based on energy, for example, are very strong. And I think these challenges kind of dictate a little bit the foreign policy. For example, it will also dictate, if the energy costs are rising, the pressure to get relatively cheap energy from Russia will increase. So this will probably increase some real political consideration. For example, if the energy costs will go down, maybe there will be more ideal-based foreign policy. But I think in several issues, Germany has to fight with these contradicting goals. I don't know if I answered the question. I try to answer it with an example to show how difficult it is to have a clear prediction of one type of foreign policy.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. John Graham asks all panelists to comment on areas of security cooperation, especially the prospect of how they are each developing Indo-Pacific strategy. Maybe Senator Harder, can I start with you?
Yeah, sure. I think that Germany has had a long engagement in Asia I would suggest that Madam Merkel pay particular attention to China, both in terms of the economic interests of Germany in the trade and investment side. But she made the annual heads of government visits and reciprocity that has stood Germany in good stead. But like Canada, I think we are all looking to broaden that engagement to the Indo-Pacific for both economic and strategic reasons. Canada joined the TPP, the CCP-TPP, in some measure to take advantage of the non-China economic interests of Asia, but also to demonstrate to China that our engagement wasn't wholly dependent on just a economic relationship with China. I think that the new coalition's emphasis on Indo-Pacific strategy is that broadening out in a German context. I believe there are ways in which Canada and Germany can work together in that shared tilt toward Asia more broadly. And I would encourage diplomatic discussions between governments, but also involving our business organizations, which have been active in China and in other parts of Asia. We have much to learn from each other. And as we all know, the 21st century will see considerable economic growth in Asia, which will have its consequences in terms of the shifts of geopolitical influence.
Thank you. Heidi, would you like to say something on the topic?
Yeah, maybe I can just briefly add that I think here Germany and Canada are both influenced by the US's turn, and the increasing use of this term Indo-Pacific is also a synonym for values-based foreign policy. So I think really parsing out exactly what that means and the potential challenges there with countries like India would be something that would be very useful to really talk through. And that goes back to Margaret's question about human rights and robust democracy. So how do we bring all of those things together is, I think, something that's really crucial in thinking through an Indo-Pacific strategy.
Thank you very much. In light of the many questions which we have, I'd like to ask the chair to allow me to extend the session by 5 to 10 minutes. Thank you. Virginie Tardif asks, Professor Stockhammer seemed to say that the coalition agreement was sparse on details on security issues. What can we read between the lines of the agreement about Germany's priorities on international peace and security issues? Where can Canada and Germany work more on these issues? Daniel?
Maybe some examples, but they've already kind of been mentioned. Human rights, there's a deterioration of human rights, there's democratic backsliding. So democracy promotion could be one. As Heidi has said, fight against the pandemic, that could become an initiative. They're already very strong in electoral observations. Normally Germans and Canadians have the strongest group of observers. And there could be, what has also been mentioned, maybe a foreign policy, some kind of a common foreign policy, for example, towards China. And then maybe some other medium powers could join, and maybe even the US to have, I think that the challenges of today is that we face a lot of what's called transboundary crisis. We have discussed, and they include climate change, cyber terrorism, global migration, financial stability, the COVID pandemic, and these transboundary crises, by definition, require more cooperation. And if two medium or partners that are, let's say, strong nations but no superpowers can work together on these, this can help and hopefully bring others into to lead big coalitions. But I think that's something in general we have to keep in mind. A successful foreign policy today means shaping the largest coalitions possible, because the crises we have, they don't stop at borders, and they also don't stop at 2 or 3 borders. They're transboundary. That means they cover many countries, potentially the whole world. So and in any of these crises, there could be cooperations between Germany and Canada, and potentially bringing in more countries.
Thank you, Daniel. Since Professor Tworek has limited time with us, I'd like to leave the order of the questions and table a question by Alejandro Reyes. And Alejandro asks, for Canada and Germany, what would be the implications of a deterioration of American democracy and specifically a return of Trump or Trumpism? Senator Harder and Professor Tworek, please.
Well, without having the constraints of being in government, let me say it would be a disaster. I think that some of the withholding of affection for the United States this year has been conditioned by the experience of the last four and the fear that Trump is both an expression of and represents himself the prospect of a retrenchment of U.S. engagement internationally. That is why, again, I agree with Daniel's comment about middle powers working collaboratively on these big issues without necessarily waiting for Washington to pronounce its point of view in a particular issue. I think we've got to take more responsibility ourselves for developing the coalitions of interest across the issues that we've identified. And Germany has a big opportunity this year as it chairs the G7 to show some early leadership on the issues we've just described. And we'll see whether your chancellor, your new chancellor, has the ability that Madame Merkel and in his own way Gerhard Schröder did in the past.
Thank you. Professor Tworek, your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think it raises a whole host of huge challenges for Canada and Germany, and maybe I'll just give a couple of examples of why. One is that Germany had the second largest number of QAnon followers outside of the US. So what happens in the US doesn't stay in the US, and there are profound implications then for how German democracy would function if Trump were to be re-elected. And I think maybe the other thing I would say is that Trumpism didn't go away, and that we see the Republican Party still following a huge amount of what Trump might have wanted, including in all sorts of measures around voter suppression. So I'm not sure that we can say that it has disappeared. In fact, there are many ways in which the Republican Party continues to move down a certain path. And I would say we confront that challenge either way. And it means also continuing to think about how to strengthen democratic institutions. We saw that happen to a certain extent with the Election Modernization Act within Canada. So trying to think about how to regulate elections, that will be worth continuing to think about in Germany. And I think, as I said, more broadly thinking about what are the ways to build trust in democratic institutions, to shore them up. And this kind of moment in the US is one that should spur other democracies to think about how to do those.
And the last question for you, Professor Tworek. Are Canada or Germany ready for the digital era? Germany's or Canada's network infrastructures are lagging behind smaller countries. Germany's internet infrastructure needs enhancing and improved as expressed by the new government statements. Acknowledgement.
Yes, so I think this is, this is an obvious statement where we can simply say yes. For a long time, Germany's expenditure on digital infrastructure was really lagging behind. It was the lowest in the G7. So this creates all sorts of problems if you want to have a digital economy, if you don't even have the basics of fast internet infrastructure. Canada, similarly, and also there are lots of equity issues around this as well, because internet is harder to access more rural communities. For Indigenous communities, there are still people who simply do not have not only no access to water, but also really no access to the internet. And within Canada, at least, there's also the question of expense. So one way to reframe this is the right to have access to high-speed internet something that we should see as basically a public good. We should be providing this like we do electricity, water, etc., and investing a huge amount into this. So I would say these are infrastructural questions that are crucial, they're expensive, but if we think about internet infrastructure like having access to the post and being able to receive a letter, that's going to get us a lot further, and it's also really an equity question as well.
At this point, I would like to thank you, Professor Torek, for your contributions. I know you have to go now, you have other obligations. Thank you for your participation, and good day to the West Coast. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
And the final question I like to ask, and thank you, Harry, whoever Harry is, for your patience. Harry asks, can the speakers elaborate on the potential response Germany would have as a regard to the intensifying Russia-Ukraine conflict? And I think that's also a question for Senator Harder, because we could extend the questions to what is the potential response of Canada also with its huge interest in the Ukraine? Maybe Senator Harder first and then Daniel.
Yeah, sure. It's certainly a timely question. I hope that our diplomats are heavily engaged collaboratively in pushing for a diplomatic resolution at this point, because there are a basis on which diplomacy could contribute to a cooling off of the intense heat that this week is feeling, and Canada and Germany cooperating in this regard could be very important. The Minsk agreements are very fresh in the minds of our diplomats as they would be of Germany's, and the geography compels Germany, and the diaspora and the politics compels Canada. There are areas in which we should be, and I'm sure are, working together, and I can only hope that the diplomacy succeeds.
Thank you, Senator. Daniel?
I mean, for Germany, it would probably mean a lot of pressure to stop Nord Stream 2. It would require a combined EU response, potentially, including other countries, to implement sanctions. I mean, when we're talking about implication would be a full-fledged war. So, I mean, if this were to happen, I think then, and I think there would also be a lot of pressure within the German government, because the two small parties, the Green Party and the Liberals, they have, I mean, I think they are less realpolitik and more ideal-based politics. So I think within their basis, there would be a lot of pressure to have a strong response to Russia. So I think this could potentially also, I mean, weaken the German-Russian relations, which are potentially stronger still than relations of other Western countries with Russia. So I think the stakes are very high.
Final contribution. I'd like to ask Elizabeth Kingston now to come back and hand over to her for a final word, and I'd like to personally thank Professor Harder, Senator Harder and Professor Stockemer for their very interesting and valuable contributions. Thank you very much, and I would like also to thank the many people from many countries for joining into this interesting discussion.
Yeah, Dr. Ashbourne, absolutely. We'd very much like to thank Senator Harder and Daniel Stockemer and Heidi Tworek for their really insightful contributions, and to you, Dr. Ashbourne, for your wonderful moderating of this evening's event. Truly, it is a very important time, a very crucial time in our diplomatic relationship, as everyone has pointed out. And we are like-minded allies and strong partners, and certainly what continues on in a testament to that strong relationship that we all very much hold dear. So I'd like to thank you all very much for this evening, and thank you very much, Dr. Ashbourne, for the ability to partner with you this evening on such an important subject. And I wish you all a good night, and thank you.